Paul Carrington made me an offer I couldn't refuse. I had been doing full-time research in Washington for 10 years after practicing law at the Department of Justice. And during one of those periods when I'd spent almost 3 years at the Brookings Institution writing a couple of books, Paul came to see me out of the blue, as I remember it. I can't remember what previous contact we'd had, if any, but probably little or none. He was then at Michigan, and he had been doing a project on government lawyers, and he'd produced a paper on government lawyers, and he knew that I was an ex-government lawyer, and that he'd found out somehow that I also had a project on government lawyers, which eventuated in a book called The Bureaucracy, that is, legal bureaucracy. And we exchanged ideas about that subject. That's really why he came to see me. And years later, completely out of the blue, I think, at least as I remember it, this is my version of the story, he contacted me and asked me to come down. And I was, as I say, I'd been doing 10 years of full-time research, and it was actually a good time to move. So I told Judy that I was going down to Duke for an interview. Was that okay? And she said absolutely not. She wasn't leaving Washington under any circumstances. And I went down for the interview and eventually was offered the job. And when I came back, she still had the same position, that she wasn't ready to leave, and particularly because our kids were happy in their schools, and you know how it is with kids. So I said, well, we at least owe it to ourselves to have a look. And of course, like all people who are offered jobs, we were offered a chance to come down and have a look at the place and look at real estate and so on and so forth. As it happened, this was the first week in March. And you may have noticed, this 1980, you may have noticed that Durham is vulnerable to blizzards often during the first week in March. And we got stuck in a hell of a blizzard. Jim Cox had to borrow, if I remember this right, he had to borrow chains to put on his car from Don Beskind, if I have it right. The caterer, I think, either threatened to fail or did fail at the Shim's house, and they had to improvise a meal for us. And in the end, all flights were canceled for days. And we spent about 4 days. The Carringtons then moved us from our hotel to their house, and we spent 4 days with the Carringtons. We found them quite amiable hosts, and the result is that Judy was moved to accept the offer as well. So that's how we got here, by virtue of a blizzard, I would say.